Here we go. This is episode 19. In Malibu, getting the devil's due to be skybound. Our love for comics and all its imprints. What's up? Welcome to Be Happy I Didn't Kill You, Confessions of a Recovering Angry Girl. Sam here, your host with the most stacks of still to read comics. Today's topic is our love for Image Comics and all its impressions. And here to discuss with me is Josh. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hey, what's going on? It's me, the Strasburg.
I
Sorry.
knew you'd get that title. I'm like, I know it's going to be so hard for Josh not to laugh at that.
I know. I was like, I felt bad because I was like, oh shit. Like, if that were me on my podcast, I would have just stopped and started over again because like somebody's laughing and like stepping on my intro.
Hey, I worked on that title. I got creative with it, so
Yeah,
it's worth
yeah,
like the laugh interruption.
yeah, for sure. It was a genuine reaction. I liked it. All the way back to Malibu. Like that's the deep cut. That's for the
Yeah,
people who really know what's going on.
for for anyone that doesn't know what we're laughing about. um, so introducing Josh here, from Raised by Rentals, and Jess and I have known each other for over 20 years now, and we are both gigantic comic fans.
Oh yeah,
That's,
absolutely. I think that's
uh,
it's probably the single defining trait of my personality at this point.
but that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's not a bad. So our shout out for this week will be Raised by Rentals podcast, where Josh and Mike improv and improve on pop culture greats from the VHS era. And anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you nailed it. Yeah, Race Rentals is the only thing that I'm really focusing on right now outside of reading comics.
Yeah.
I've had a few other projects going on, but I always also want to shout out the Rad Pantheon, and I'm sure you'll mention that later. But I'll just mention it now because we have a really great network of podcasts and artists and musicians and all kinds of creative people at Rad Pantheon, and we all support each other. And you're a member of the Pantheon. I'm a Rad Panther too, and so while you're checking out radpantheon.com, you'll see a link on there for Raised by Rentals, the podcast. And yeah, definitely come and check us out.
Yep. And every time I post this podcast too, there is a little link to go to the website for Rad Pantheons too. So it's nice. It's awesome that we can all support each other and then have like a collective area that you can go to and like see all of us, and like find different things that you're interested in. It's definitely awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even remember where I got the inspiration from it, but years ago I was listening to a podcast. Oh, actually, it was a podcast called The Apocrypals, which has a comic book connection that I won't get into right now. And at one point, like 100 episodes in, they just started mentioning, oh, like we're now a part of the X network. I forget what it was called, and I'm like, what are they talking about? And so I Googled it, and it was just a bunch of podcasts of people who where the hosts were friends with each other and they got on this network, and one of the podcasts that ran it uh, listed all of the other podcasts underneath them as like affiliated shows. So when you went and looked up that most popular one, it would be like other episodes, and it actually would include the other podcasts. And I thought that was a really cool idea of like how to promote like your friends and the projects that they're working on. So I just stole it before I even recorded one episode. I was like, Mike, we got to do this Rad Pantheon thing. I think it'll be really fun.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, anything you can do to like promote your friends and like get the word out there and everything is always like a huge plus because
Yeah.
that's how people find out about things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it inspires other people to do creative things. Like you started a podcast and I started a podcast and everyone has a podcast, it seems.
And we're all having fun with it, which actually kind of jumps into the beginning of our discussion point here about like dream team collaborations. So different nerd points, like if you think like sports have like fantasy football and like music has like super bands, like for us comic nerds, we had Image.
Oh, yeah.
So 7 amazing artists from Marvel like creating this. And I'll
Y-
let you jump in from there.
Yeah, I'm like chomping at the bit. Like I love
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about Image Comics. It's one of my
No,
favorite
I'm gonna have a
topics.
time like not being super excited.
Yeah, exactly. It's I'm such a nerd. I actually have two books in my hand right now that have the official timeline of Image Comics with all of their major milestones and releases and stuff. And I've read both of these like multiple times because I really like to steep myself in the history of the company. um, but I was collecting comics since 1990 when I was 10 years old. I think that's when I started. And I won't get into my whole origin story. We actually went over that a little bit on an episode of Ray's Parental, so you can go find that. um,
Let's go
uh,
origin.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Secret Origins Revealed is the name of that episode that you were on with us, Sammy. We went through our secret origins. But yeah, when I was 12 in 1992, Image Comics launched, and like you said, it was a group of all of the hottest superstar artists from Marvel Comics who, yeah, were breaking sales records. They were celebrities. Some of the first people in the history of the comics industry to become millionaires from their artwork, and they all left the company at the height of their popularity to go and form their own company so they could focus on creator owned properties that they own, their own comics rather than stuff owned by Marvel. And it was a huge gamble that immediately paid off from the very first issue that came out, Youngblood #1 in 1992. And I was there. I was reading the comic shop news for months ahead of the time after the announcement was made. I was so excited about the launch. And I didn't even really know who all the artists were at that time. I was 12 with a limited allowance, so I couldn't buy every comic on the rack, and like I hadn't really ever heard of Eric
Comic Carson
Larson
is like
before.
a big one for me at that time. You know,
hmm Yeah, I don't think I'd ever read a Todd McFarlane comic at that point, but I knew who he was. For me, the big ones were Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld because I was a huge fan of like X-Men and all the spin-off titles like X-Force. So I was going for the Lee and Liefeld. I didn't really know who Eric Larson was, but I liked what I saw in the previews. And then, Jim Valentino, I didn't know who he was until later, and I realized I had actually been reading his comics because I had been reading his Guardians of the Galaxy comics at Marvel without really like putting two and two together that it was the same guy.
yeah.
uh, but yeah, I was a huge fan from day one. I bought Youngblood #1 when the day it came out. I bought every single #1 issue that came out up through I think the Max, which was one of the four titles where they expanded outside of the original founders. So we're talking probably the first year and a half to 2 years of the company. I bought every #1 issue, and then I would decide from there like what I wanted to collect with my limited allowance and what I could make with my paper route money.
Yeah. You're like, what can I get on my pull list this week?
Yeah, and I haunted the comic shop so much when I was a kid. I ended up working at it by the time I was 15. That's a different story. The Image has started to kind of wane in quality and popularity by that point. But for those first couple of years, I went from being a total Marvel zombie and reading everything that Marvel put out that I could afford to reading almost nothing but Image comics.
Yeah. But I mean, like you said, the great artists and stuff went from Marvel to Image, so it's like what you wanted to see was there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I jumped right over, and there was a lot of familiar, we'll say, familiar characters, I guess, because, a lot has been said over the years about how original or unoriginal some of the Image Comics founder characters may have been. People like to look at Spawn and Shadowhawk as like, oh, that's just like, Spider-Man and Batman mixed up. Or you look at the Wildcats, or even more so Cyberforce, and it's just the X-Men with different code names. um, but I didn't mind because I was like, well, cool. Now I get to I get to keep reading Mark Silvestri drawing the X-Men, except they're not called the X-Men anymore. They're called Stryker and Ripclaw and Heatwave.
Spawn was so good too. Like my favorite arc from that was the suture one, where that was like the girl, it was made up of like a bunch of like rape victims and other things and like fighting crime.
Oh yeah, I found that out later. Actually, Spawn was one of the titles that I didn't actively collect back in the '90s. Like I said, I bought every #1 issue, but I
I
couldn't afford to buy every single comic, so I had to pick and choose. And I chose against Spawn, but I caught up later.
Yeah, that's what I ended up doing. I ended up waiting and then kind of reading like most of it when it was out at once.
Yeah, and now is a really, really good time if you want to catch up on Spawn. I just recently, about 2 years ago now, I guess, I read the first 50 issues because they have collected the first two or 200 or maybe 250 issues together into these big paperback compendiums, 50 issues each. They're only $60 cover price, which is like, it's still like an expensive book, but for 50 issues, and it doesn't skip any issues. Like, even the ones that he had legal trouble with, like some of the, it was either Spawn like 10 or 11 with the first appearance of Angela that Todd McFarlane no longer owns, but he was able to get the right to reprint all those old issues. So some of the old Spawn trade paperbacks don't reprint every single issue because of some of the legal troubles that Todd McFarlane got in, but the new compendiums have every single issue. So I was excited to be able to go back and read all of that. And then, of course, I started reading all the spin-off titles, and I read the Violator miniseries and the Angela miniseries, and you name it. I probably reread everything from Spawn from the first 4 or 5 years, and then I took a break, and I've been working on some other reading projects. But it was fun to go back and revisit that stuff in like one big chunk.
Yeah, I love it when they come out with books like that too, because you're getting like all the stories and just like sitting down and reading it all instead of being like, oh, am I gonna have to like collect the trades or collect the single issues, or like you find a lot of stuff online for free, which is super awesome too. And I know like you share it sometimes with us and everything, and in our group, you know.
Yeah, and our Red Pantheon chat, I'd love to do that. I always wonder if anybody cares, but yeah, whenever I can find free comics online, I love to show them off. And I read a lot of underground and independent comics. I used to support a lot of guys on Kickstarter, and so I have a ton of digital comics from like smaller, lesser known artists who are just trying to get their books out there. I mean, I probably have hundreds of issues of comics that like the average person hasn't heard of, and so I'm always trying to send my Dropbox link to somebody, like, come check this stuff out. It's so cool.
Yeah, like we were saying before, the best way to get it out is just, word of mouth. Be like, oh, I know you're into this, so check this out. Like, it would be pretty cool. And then so you were saying like some of your favorite Image comics, like ones that you go back to and like reread like a few times.
Oh yeah, I go back and reread comics as often as I can while trying not to get too far behind in my to read list. Like
That's a struggle.
oh, I have hundreds of comics that I own right now that I have yet to read, and yet I can't help myself when I pick up some comics and I'm like, oh man, I really want to go back and read some old Wildcats or something, and then. And me being me with my OCD, I can't just go back and revisit Wildcats, which was my favorite Image comic at the time when I was a kid. I can't just go back and read that. Instead, what I do is I made a list after doing a ton of research of every single comic that Wildstorm, which was the imprint that put out Wildcats at Image, owned by Jim Lee, every single comic book that they ever published in their 20-year history from Image to DC, now owned by DC. I literally made a list of every single comic that they ever published. It was like 2,000 something issues, and I have about 230 left, and I've been working on that list for 6 years now.
Oh wow, that is impressive. That is pretty awesome. Like you definitely like know the label.
Oh yeah, and what's funny is
Are you
I
doing, like,
couldn't just stop
alphabet?
there. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Are you like doing it in alphabetical order, or is there like a different like theme like you're going for? For
No, I did the research along with some other fans that I found online in some Facebook fan groups where we did the research to put together a chronological list of all of the events in the comics. So it's pretty close to the release order. But there's this one guy who I met online, and he actually went back into like the first couple of years of the Wildstorm comics, and he figured out how the Wildcats and Stormwatch and Gen 13 and other books, how they fit together chronologically, so you could read all the events. And they used to do a lot of crossovers in the 90s where you had to read like every title that they published, and that's kind of where it came from. And yeah, so I've been reading them in chronological order so I can get the whole story from the beginning of the line.
Oh man, that's awesome. Yeah, they seem to love that because it's like Image is like a universe in itself. Like they all kind of exist within like that universe, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that's really fun, and it's one of the interesting conceits about Image Comics when it first launched. I think that made it interesting because it wasn't the first comic book company or collaboration of artists that were focused on creator owned. You know, back in the 80s, guys like Dave Sim and Sergio Aragones and Stan Sakai and even Jeff Smith, who does Bone, you know, they had banded together back in the 80s and start doing self-publishing. The most successful people from that group of like-minded artists who got together are Eastman and Laird, the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which, you know, famously for decades was creator owned by them. Image shined a light on it because they were these superstar artists and because they were the first creator owned company to be successful at doing a shared universe. Yeah, so the Wildcats, Cyberforce, Shadowhawk, Spawn, Youngblood, and Savage Dragon all existed supposedly within
Yeah,
the same universe. and
every
and the
once in a while you can get like a little something like an Easter egg in the background or something, you know.
Yeah, the first year or two that they were putting out comics, there was a lot of crossover. You would see Savage Dragon, for example, as a police officer. He would show up in a lot of other comics. He would show up in Shadowhawk or, you know, show up in Cyberforce or something. And yeah, Eric Larson was better about. He would just have Spawn in the background of a panel, and like he wouldn't even interact with the dragon. He would just be there. So if you noticed him, it was a cool, fun detail.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, Youngblood was in Wildcats by the third issue. Shadowhawk first appeared in the second issue of Youngblood. So yeah, they were doing those inter imprint crossovers like almost from the very beginning. But here's an interesting piece of trivia. That I've learned, if you're interested, in is I'll say I have not only been reading Wildstorm comics over the last 5 or 6 years, because my OCD knows no bounds, I could not help myself but to do the exact same thing for Spawn, Shadowhawk, Cyberforce, Youngblood, and of course now I'm forgetting one, right? But all of the original 6 titles, I did the same thing where I made a chronological list of like every comic that they ever published. I abandoned my read through of the extreme titles, which were the spin-offs of Youngblood, because it just frankly got to the point where I just couldn't handle it anymore because it was so bad. uh, and I fell off of Spawn after a while just because it was a lot and I wanted to take a break. But yeah, I've been reading through Savage Dragon and Shadowhawk. I actually already finished every Cyberforce comic and all the spin-offs that they ever published. But what I learned was that the original Image Comics shared universe, not only does it not exist, it's actually been destroyed 3 times over the years. So the shared Image comic universe still exists. You can still read. Well, these days, the only comic that I ever see crossover is stuff like Radiant Black or Local Man. But you know, even 5 or 6 years ago, Invincible and Shadowhawk would team up with Savage Dragon, but they're not even the same characters from the original universe. Not to get too far down this rabbit trail, but you know, twice in the 90s they did intercompany crossovers. There was one called Shattered Images, where they actually all agreed to kind of hit like a reset button. And when Rob Liefeld left the company and took Youngblood with him, they like erased Youngblood from like the continuity, like erased from history. And then like they destroyed the multiverse and like rebuilt it. And then years later in like 2000 or 2001, when Savage Dragon hit its 101st issue, he had this like world devourer Galactus type character called Universo, who came and ate the earth, like destroyed it, and all of the characters from Savage Dragon escaped into another dimension. And now it's been 23 years and they still live in the alternate dimension, and the comic has just taken off from there. Like they just carried on, but that original universe is gone.
So we should say congratulations to the new universe that has lasted the longest.
Yes, exactly.
Nobody has had to fuck up this one, so
Yeah,
we should have to cancel it and start over.
exactly. It's
But
lasted this long.
they can, cancel it all and start over. They know what to do for that.
Yeah. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. It was an interesting way of saying, hey, maybe our shared universe was a failed experiment because we have too many superstar egos trying to, be in charge or whatever. So they eventually just decided, let's just do our own thing. And now the official line that I hear from Eric Larson, at the very least, is that yes, Invincible and Shadowhawk and all these other characters, they exist in the same universe as Savage Dragon, but they're only like his versions of it. So like when you read the Invincible comic book by Robert Kirkman and Ryan Ottley, it's not the same Invincible that might show up in Savage Dragon. Like they're all alternate reality versions of each other, and that way they can do whatever they want without having to worry about the person who created that character getting pissed off that they did something stupid.
Yep. And then like Kurtman joined Image Comics later, and then they did a crossover with a Invincible. Well, not a crossover. They did like a issue of Walking Dead that had an issue of Invincible on the back. Because I remember that's the only issue of Invincible that I've read so far. Because I
Oh,
haven't read
okay.
that one yet. But then I've almost gotten through all my Walking Dead. I'm actually more caught up on the show than I am in the comics. But I only have, I think, like 25 more to go, and then
Oh,
I'm at
nice.
the end of it. And then of course I got like the side ones they did too. There was one, there's a few of them I just got that were like on hardcover. I got a hardcover version of them so I could get like all the collection at once.
Oh yeah, for Walking Dead spinoffs, yeah, they did a prequel called Here's Negan.
Yep.
They did a prequel about Rick's brother. It's called The Alien.
Yeah.
I read those, and it's funny because I just read issue 108 because me being me, I had to add Robert Kirkman's creations to my Invincible or my Image founder list, and I have also been reading through those. So I read every single issue of Invincible, including all of the spin-off titles, of which there are over 140 issues that aren't Invincible, and I've read up to issue 108 so far of The Walking Dead. But I also read all the prequels because I read them in chronological order.
Yeah, I didn't do the prequels yet. Like I picked them up yet, but I haven't read them. I'm like, I'm gonna finish reading all the comics, then I'm gonna read these since these got released after those.
And there's a really fun story if you get a chance to check it out. I haven't read it yet because I don't want to spoil anything in The Walking Dead because I actually never finished reading it either. I dropped off somewhere around issue 80 something originally years ago, not on purpose, but that was a book that I was collecting in trade paperback and I just fell behind. So now I'm catching up, just going to the library because I got the entire stack from my local library and took them home. But there's a series that Robert Kirkman put out through the Skybound imprint called Skybound X. It came out in, I want to say 2021, maybe around that time. And it was an anthology title, 6 issues long. And every issue just had 3 or 4 short stories in it that were all previews of Skybound comics. So you like a teaser, a sampler.
Yeah.
But the thing that he included to really entice people who were already fans to go and buy the series is he did a story that ran through all 5 or 6 of the issues called Rick Grimes 3000, and I'll just let you imagine what that could possibly be about.
Robots, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, it's really fun. They did print it as a hardcover standalone, so you can buy it as the hardcover. I think I got that for Alvarez for Christmas a year or two ago. But yeah, I have the Skybound X issues, and I flipped through them, and I'm like, oh, this looks so fun because yeah, it's full of like crazy sci-fi stuff. But I'm like, no, I'm gonna wait because I don't want to spoil anything. Like with my luck, somebody will say some random line of dialogue that gives away like a major character death that I haven't gotten to yet.
Speaking of Alvarez, that's the one that got me into Walking Dead. So I think he introduced me to it, and they were like 30 issues in. And he was like, "Oh, you need to check this out." So he just let me like borrow his, and then I started adding it to my pull list. And of course, I was like, "Zombies!" I had to have it anyways.
Gotta have some. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And pirates. Speaking, did you ever read Sea of Red?
I did. I'm trying to think. That's Rick Remender wrote that, right? I think was it Kieran Twyer who did the artwork? I can't remember offhand. But yes, it was a really great series about. It's been years since I read it, but yeah, there was like this pirate who was like thrown overboard or whatever, and he like didn't die in like the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, it was super interesting. The other one that like popped up, I was thinking, was Back to Brooklyn, but I couldn't remember what
Hmm.
that was about. But I remember it being really good.
Yeah, that is really good. If I remember correctly, I think that's a Jimmy Palmiotti story. I'm actually going to look it up right now because I own it. I read it. I have it
Yeah,
downstairs, and it's a cool book, and it's like a Brooklyn, like a New York mobster story, but it's also kind of horror at the same time. And I think Jimmy Palmiotti does a lot of good books like that as a writer. And he's an inker as well, but as a writer, he does a lot of
I,
books where he does like genre mashups.
I just remember like it was so good, but I didn't end up picking it up. I just read it somewhere.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, I just looked up. It's Jimmy Palmiotti actually writing it with Garth Ennis, so you know it's going to be good because
Yeah, I think that's what probably even drew me to it. There's certain like artists or writers where you're like, as soon as you see their name,
oh yeah, absolutely. For me, I actually quit reading comics in the late '90s when I was in high school because I was like too cool for that kiddie stuff, man. But I got back in around 2000, so it's been 24 years that I've been collecting again pretty consistently. But when I got back in 2000, it was like the whole industry was changed drastically. The late '90s was a huge bust for the collector speculator boom. Like Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 1997. Image, broke up. Rob Liefeld left. Jim Lee left. So many things were different. So in addition to stuff like The Walking Dead that Alvarez hooked me onto, I remember him reading issue 3 was the first one, but I didn't pick it up until I read the first 6 trades all at once, which was I think 36 issues. So I already kind of knew I had a big chunk of it right off the bat. But yeah, in the 2000s, my favorite comic at that time was Powers by Brian Michael Bendis and Michael Avon Oeming, and I
yeah,
absolutely could not get enough of that. It was the comic where I would go to the comic shop, I'd had to buy every single issue. I couldn't wait for the trades, and I would read it in the car in the parking lot before I drove home. I just could not wait.
that's great. There's been ones where I've done that too. You're just like so excited, especially like it was kind of like when you were watching TV shows when you were younger and you had
Hmm.
to like wait that whole week. And it was like comics, like, okay, where's the rest of the story?
Yeah, hurry up. I know that's part of why I switched to becoming a trade waiter in the early 2000s. After I got back into collecting in 2000, I lasted, I don't know, 3 or 4 years before I just gave up almost entirely on single monthly issues. And I was only buying trade paperbacks and hardcovers and pretty much only buying them secondhand on eBay because I was broke. And I would go to the library all the time. And I got so hooked on being able to get big chunks of the story at once that for years I didn't collect any single issue comics. I might buy one once in a while if it wasn't reprinted in some hardcover somewhere, but I did not have a pull list. Again, after 2003, 2004, I actually just started my latest one in 2022. So
Oh,
I went for a really long time.
yeah, I haven't had one since Don's Atomic Comics closed. That's been
Oh
a while.
yeah.
Yeah, and I know like the mid like 2000s, 2010 and stuff, I was finding tons of trades for like super cheap. Like you go to the comic book store and they just have like stacks of trades for like, $5 or 2 for $5 or something.
Hmm.
So I just started buying them that way too. And then a lot of times like I'd wait till I like had the whole story together and then I would just sit down and read through the whole story.
Yeah, yeah, I used to love to do that too. And I go back and I reread comics because like from in my opinion, I have some things that I collect as artifacts. Like I collect it because it's a thing that I want to own, because the thing has value to me, the object. But when it comes to comics, most of the stuff that I have is stuff that I want to read again.
Yeah.
And I won't get into all of the details of it, but for years, because I was broke and I was reading so much that I just couldn't afford to keep up with comics. So I would just buy and sell stuff, and I would only keep trade paperbacks and hardcovers on my bookshelf if it was like something really good, like just okay, wasn't good enough to stay. That would be on eBay funding the next book that I want to buy, you know? Um,
But at
so
least
the
it was fun, you know?
Yeah, for me, it's about the experience of reading it. Like, I don't necessarily need to own the object. I do like that, but I tend to spend more money buying like big fancy hardcovers or like foreign editions or, stuff with like limited edition covers or stuff that like you're not going to just find anywhere like at the library. And I like to own those so that I have all these like, pretty little baubles on my shelf. But if I bought everything that I read, I mean, I would be bankrupt.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Oh,
Because I read a crazy amount.
speaking of, I was trying to sell on that site that you led me to, and I
Hmm.
don't think they like me because they won't accept any of my sale posts.
Really? Oh, okay. We'll have to talk out offline about that. I was looking for them too. I was like, wait, why hasn't
Yeah,
Sam posted
I'll
yet? What's
send you.
going on?
I'm like, and I kind of copied like what you were doing and stuff,
Hmm.
and I'm like, I don't know what's going on, so I have to send you a screenshot. But I'm
Yeah.
trying to do to kind of rotate out, stuff that I know I'm not gonna read again, or I'm not gonna like pass on to like I'll like push some stuff onto like my nieces and nephew to read. Like
Hmm.
Walking Dead definitely was a big one where like my niece has read all of them too.
Nice. Yeah. It's funny. It's a testament to like what am I trying to say here? Like I've been collecting comics again for 24 years. I have an entire wall in my library downstairs that's just solid square bound paperbacks and hardcovers, like floor to ceiling, 13 feet across. Like it's this huge shelf. And I'm not saying that to brag, but I'm saying that in 24 years, those are the books that have made it through multiple purges, multiple cullings, where I've just like grabbed shit and sold it off to get it out of my way or to make room or to make money to buy more comics. So all the stuff that I have downstairs in my library is like, come into my lair and look at all my pretties, you know.
That's a good point about that, like going into the society view of it. Like people don't realize how many comics there are. How many comics there are, how many comic companies there are, like just and it's not like what people say, like what you said earlier, how like little kid stuff and everything. Like there's comics about everything. Like
Yeah,
it's crazy.
absolutely everything. Yeah, you're totally right. And in fact, we talk a lot about superheroes, and I love superheroes. That's how I got into reading comics in the first place. I love the New Warriors at Marvel, and I will go on and on about them at length. I know more about them than I know about Image Comics, if that tells you anything, But and I love Image Comics, but I actually don't read a lot of superhero comics in comparison to other genres. I read a lot of autobiographical, and just like straight like dramatic fiction, a lot of underground comics. But I also love science comics and history comics, and I have a lot of those. I have a huge collection, and I have a biography of Niels Bohr. I have biographies of like Einstein, and Feynman, and stories about paleontology, graphic novels about bees, and the life cycle of spiders, and all this other stuff. And they were great for my kids too, because when they were young, and I was leery about just letting them have free reign to my collection, because I have a lot of stuff that's R rated or X rated or just not appropriate. But I could grab these big stacks of comics, and they're not for kids. They're just science, about science and history and whatever. And I knew that they could read those, and not only are they just educational kids, but they're like amazing books.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And like that's so awesome that there's like so many different kinds. And like I was watching History 365 earlier that like comes with our TV for free. And like I'm a huge history fan. Like one of my fondest memories, actually one of the really good memories I do have from my grandma, is I had to do a report on Abraham Lincoln when I was in sixth grade. And for that summer, she took me to every place that Abraham Lincoln was. Like we just drove to all these states and all these cities and went to
That's
the
cool.
museums and like listened. Yeah. And I loved it. I was like, oh my God, this was so great. Like I even still will take myself on like tours, like the cemetery does like history tours through the cemetery and stuff. So I'll
Hmm.
do like those during the summer and stuff. And it's just like it's just cool that you can learn about that in life and everything, but then you can also have a comic that's kind of going over
Hmm.
and give you that visual with like that knowledge coming in too. And it's just like it's such a cool thing. And then they also had like, did you ever read Rough Riders, where it was like Roosevelt and some other
Hmm.
guys history and stuff, and kind of like their gang and everything. And it was
Hmm.
really cool. And then League of Extraordinary Gentlemen,
Oh yeah, absolutely
which I,
love that.
yeah, both huge fans of that. That was like so good.
Yeah, I'm a huge Alan Moore fan. Like, that's another one of those creators where if he works on something, I'm gonna read it, even
Yeah.
though I have personal disputes or disagreements with like him as a person, with some of the actions and some of the things even that he writes about, some of the content of things that he writes about that I don't, agree with, or I'm not comfortable with in some cases. I don't want to get into details, but when it comes to like politics or sexual identity and things like that, I don't always agree with it, but he's such an amazing writer that I can't help but want to go and like experience the book, even though I might walk away from it going, okay, I can't believe he did that to that one character, but at the same time, I can't help myself because I have a Watchmen tattoo, so I've been a huge fan since I was a kid.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And like how we were saying superhero and stuff for Image, the Sidekick. Did you ever read that one?
Yeah, yeah, that was really good.
Great. It was an enjoyable one. I don't really read too many of the superhero ones either, but um so we were saying some other labels and stuff that are like key ones that you enjoy.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to superheroes, I definitely stuck to like Image and Marvel mostly over the years. I've only really recently gone back and tried to educate myself on DC. I've gone back and read a lot of their old crossovers and stuff that I never really got into. There's been some other imprints over the years, but again, I don't read as many superhero comics as I read other types of books. And for me, the two
Hero.
publishers. I'm sorry, what?
But not just superheroes, like any other like labels, like like Vertigo.
Yeah, I was gonna say for me, the two or three other like imprints or companies that I always loved were definitely Vertigo. Um, Again, I have a huge list of like every Vertigo comic ever, and I've only like dipped my toe into it, going back and reading Alan Moore Swamp Things from the '80s. But I'm a huge fan of like Sandman and Hellblazer and stuff like that, and of course Preacher. But in terms of like smaller, more independent companies, Top Shelf and Ad House books are my probably two favorite. Top Shelf I think is probably more well known. They've published guys like Alan Moore and Jeffrey Brown and James Kolchalka. They're actually owned by IDW now. They're a sub imprint. And Ad House Books is no longer in business. They went out of business a couple of years ago. It was an independent company run by just one guy, and Chris Pitzer, who I've become sort of friendly with online now, which is fun, because I belong to some comic book fan groups that he's a part of, which is kind of cool, to kind of reminisce about some of the old Ad House books. But the one creator that people might know is Jim Rugg, the creator of Street Angel, which is now published by Image Comics, which you should definitely check out if you haven't seen it.
Nice.
Yeah, Street Angel is about a 12-year-old homeless ninja with a skateboard.
It already sounds awesome.
Yeah, it is. And there's a blaxploitation prequel called Aphrodisiac that's really fun.
That's awesome. And Top Shelf does like those compilation ones that they put out every once in a while where you get like a whole bunch of stories in like a big trade.
Yeah, yeah. They haven't done it in a long time since they've been owned by IDW, but it actually started off as an anthology where the title Top Shelf was the title of the book, and then they eventually expanded it for the whole company. But yeah, and they used to be really big back in the 2000s on Free Comic Book Day, because while they publish a lot of different types of books, they have a really strong line of comics for like younger kids, like real cartoony stuff like Johnny Boo, and Dragon Puncher and things like that. And so an Owlie by Andy Runton. So they used to do a lot of the Free Comic Book Day comics, and they would put out like multiple books on Free Comic Book Day for like kids. So I was always a big fan of Top Shelf. Um,
Yeah, I always picked up their stuff too. And then Vertigo also would put out like a compilation type thing.
yeah, yeah. It's funny. I'll tell this fun story, like, because it's always cool like I mentioned with Chris Pitzer with Ad House, where I get to kind of talk to him online a little bit now. And I belong to this one fan group, and somebody in the group was asking for recommendations about old Vertigo comics, and I just piped up and was like, like what are some like underappreciated, like unknown comics from the heyday of Vertigo, back in the day, when, in the early 2000s, when things like, Preacher were still really big, and Transmetropolitan, and Shelley Bond, who was an editor for Vertigo way back then, and she actually joined the group conversation and was telling all of these really cool behind the scenes stories about all these comics and creators, because she worked at Vertigo for like 10 years as one of the head editors. And it was so fun. Like I was just picturing myself and all the other people in the fan group. We were just like, we were all sitting around a campfire, like listening to Shelley Bond tell stories,
When you were saying that, I was thinking the same thing, or like on little mats,
Yeah.
like the little like just sitting there and like with our hands under our chins, like grinning up.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was so fun.
In the 90s too, they re-released like all the EC stuff. They did the Tales from the Crypt and stuff, and towards like the mid 90s.
Yeah, that's unfortunately an area of comics that I have underrepresented in my collection, and I one of these days I'm going to make a reading project out of those, in the same way that that I did with all the Image comics and the Vertigo comics, where I've read a lot of Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, and stuff like that. And Fantagraphics is another great
Oh,
publisher that also has been reprinting a lot of books from that era, but not the horror ones. They've been reprinting a lot of the sci-fi and war comics over the last like 10 years.
EC library
Hmm.
archive too, where they're doing, it's like different artists. They're like putting all their stuff into one book,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
have a ton of those are freaking amazing. Those are fantastic.
Yeah, I love those. And it's like one of those things where I know once I start, I'm not going to be able to make myself stop. And I'm going to read nothing but, EC comics forever. Like it'll take me, years and years to get through them all. So one of these days when I need a new project, I'll tackle that. And, again, me being me, I'll make a list of every comic they ever published for like 20 years, and I'll have to read them all.
Yeah, that's one of my big obsessions, to the point where I even got like the EC logo on my ears.
Yeah, that's so cool. I really love that.
I don't know. They were just so good. They were just written so well, and I love the little twists. You know, just a good like nighttime read or morning
Mhm.
read, or like I always had one of those comics with me.
Yeah, they're so fun because you get those like little short stories. And I think people forget that up until like in the early 60s, almost every comic that was published by a major publisher was an anthology. It was the common format was you'd get like the cover story, and then you get a couple of shorter stories in the back, because they were patterned after magazines,
Pulp
and
and
yeah,
stuff.
and pulp
Yep.
novels, yeah. And the first comic books were just reprints of newspaper comic book strips or comic strips. So, having a comic where you pick it up and you expect to have multiple stories for your dime, that was the norm back then. Yeah, I'm still a big fan of anthologies, like you mentioned. Putting out like a compilation of a bunch of like short stories, like Vertigo used to do that, and Top Shelf, and a lot of companies still do. Image Comics, back to our main topic, they've put a lot of anthology series out over the years. Multi-volume series of anthologies like Aftershock and Pop Gun, and most recently for their 30th anniversary in 2022, they put out a 12-issue anthology series of singles, where they had like 4 and 5 page stories from some of their big creators who are popular now, mixed in with a couple of like the old guys, and that ran for 12 issues. It was just called Image with an exclamation point.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and one thing, it was cool too. The reason I mainly picked it up, even though it looked really cool and it had stuff in there from like Scott Snyder's Witches, for example, but one of the things that I was drawn to was they actually brought back the character Dutch from Youngblood, which is again a little bit of a deep cut if you remember that character created by Chap Yap, and he was a fan favorite character, and he wasn't owned by Rob Liefeld, who had owned Youngblood at the time. He was a creator-owned character that Chap Yap created, who was the artist of the spin-off book Team Youngblood, and he went into animation back in the 90s and just disappeared from comics, and he was like a wonderkind. Like he got into comics when he was like 18 or 19, but yeah, he's returned to comics with a new Dutch story in the Image anthology. So anyone out there listening who's a real old school nerd, like you and me, would probably appreciate that.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out. And how is your family and friends with your supportive of your comic collection? Your comic is
Oh, I definitely sometimes feel like I'm on an island by myself. No, in my house, everybody knows that, dad is going to bring up something about comics in every conversation. Like I can't help myself. We'll be watching a movie or, listening to a song, or telling a story about friends, and inevitably I can't help myself and I'll be like, oh, that reminds me of this one comic.
kind of a funny question. Have you ever bought comics for Christina?
Only once ever. So yeah, my wife Christina does not read comics. She really doesn't have any interest. I actually impressed Tegan, my oldest, at the store the other day because I saw a comic. I saw Blankets by Craig Thompson, and I picked it up and I was like, look, this is one of the 4 comics that your mom has ever read that she liked. Yeah, so back in the early 2000s, she dabbled a little bit. She tried to read some of my stuff. She read Goodbye Chunky Rice, and like I mentioned, Blankets by Craig Thompson. But there's this amazing artist called Liz Prince. She's an underground artist. She's done a lot of artwork for like punk band album covers and stuff over the years, and she's still around. Again, just publishing independent books. But she broke out, I forget what year it was. It must have been 2007 or 2008, with this little tiny, and I mean tiny because the book was very small, this little tiny comic called Will You Still Love Me If I Wet the Bed? Which Christina, thought was just such a fun title, so I bought it so she could read it, and she did. She really liked it. And years ago, at a year or two after that, Liz Prince, who was really active on whatever Facebook or whatever social media was popular in like 2008 or 2009, she was trying to earn some extra money, and was like doing commissions like a lot of artists do. But her thing was, she was like, I won't just draw you a picture. I will draw a greeting card and send it to whoever you want. And I thought, this is perfect. So I had her send Christina a Valentine's Day card that she like drew and wrote messages in, and it was like the best Valentine's ever.
Awesome. That's super. I like really deep in like my hunt to try to like complete a bunch of my series, and I had like my pull list and I was going out and stuff. I just started like getting any like metal type comics like for Travis, or like any like horror ones he might like or anything, so I kind of like started collecting them for him too, which he thought was cool, but I don't think he's read any of them. And I like am getting to the point where like I kind of want to read them because like I haven't read some of them, so I'm like, I think I'll just enjoy them.
Yeah, you should. Well,
Yeah.
and while we're talking about Image Comics and metal comics, I have a recommendation if you haven't heard of it, and he would probably love it, which is Head Lopper by Andrew McLean. Oh my
Huh.
God, it's literally Head Lopper, Andrew McLean. There's about 3 volumes out, and it's like a giant barbarian with a sword fights monsters. That's the story, but it's basically like he's just illustrating like whatever like metal he's listening to, and it's just over the top, bloody, gory, violent, ridiculous, and his art style is like super cartoony. Not like in a animation way, but just it's so expressive and over the top, like doesn't even care about being realistic. It's almost as if Adventure Time like fast forward to like their to a destroyed post-apocalyptic future, and they're all
So
out to they're all just trying to survive in this like barbarian wasteland. Like that's kind of what it reminds me of. But yeah, Headlopper is so freaking good.
yeah, that's awesome. So do you think reading comics is healthy for you? I do.
I do, yeah.
I think
It's
yes. I think
my
that's going to expand your mind and get conversations going.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you can't tell, for me, it's like my happy place. It's what I do when I need a break at the end of the day. I hate when I go to bed and I've been so busy that I haven't had a chance to sit and read. And the beauty of comics is you can pick up like a 20-page stapled pamphlet or like a 600-page giant oversized hardcover. And so there are days when I'm just busy and I'm just wrecked and burnt out, and I was like, I don't want to go to bed. I have to sit and read something, and a single issue comic that I can read in 5 or 10 minutes. And even if I already read it before, it like just helps me to like relax.
Absolutely. And that's the nice part about it is a quick read. So you're not like forcing yourself to like stay up like, oh, to the next chapter. So it's just like
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
right now I'm reading through all the Monster High books because they just came out with a new series of them. So now there's been 4 different series. So I'm starting with the first one and I'm getting really into it. I'm actually really enjoying it.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So what is your favorite thing of the week?
My favorite thing of the week. Ooh, see, it's hard to say because I think the only thing that I have read this week has been old Image comics from the 90s. So I'll say Savage Dragon is my favorite thing of the week. I've been reading Savage Dragon since it first appeared in 1992. It is my favorite Image comic of all time. When I was a kid, I would have said it was the Wildcats, but Savage Dragon has stood the test of time. Eric Larson is still writing, drawing, inking, and sometimes lettering and coloring it by himself for 30 years. He just released issue 271, which came out about a week or two ago. And I haven't even read it yet because I have to catch up on a big backlog. But I'm just excited that he is still putting the comic out. It's an amazing story in and of itself, but the real life story of a guy who had the opportunity to just do the thing that he loved the most forever, and people pay him for it, and it's just awesome. So I'm glad Savage Dragon is still around.
Yeah, definitely. Super awesome. And my favorite thing of the week is actually I'm doing 3 recordings within a week. So I
Nice.
just recorded with Susie from Boogeyman's Closet on Saturday. We talked about podcasting. So I'm super excited for that to come out, and craziness in our 20s. And then
Hmm.
with this comic, and then I'm recording tomorrow. We're going to be talking about drummers.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah, we're
Yeah,
excited for that.
I grew up with a drummer, my brother.
Yeah. Yes, I have
Yeah.
seen your brother drum live multiple times.
Oh yeah, many, many, many times. I grew up with it. I've been in bands with him. Yeah, I mean, don't identify my brother Justin von Strasburg, independent
Yeah,
musician. Check him out at justinvonstrasburg.com.
yes, but
Or is it
shout out
just
for
exactly? Or is it justingoboom.com? I always forget. But you can just Google Justin von Strasburg. That really is his last name. My last name is Strasburg, but he's von Strasburg. But yeah, he's a multi-instrumentalist, plays all kinds of things. But man, when I was growing up, he was the drummer, and man, we listened to him bang on the drums in my house. My whole childhood, pretty much.
you had Animal.
Oh yeah,
Animal.
absolutely.
Nice. So thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out the radpantheon.com, a super team of pop culture craze creative types like me and Josh and so many others. Also go to western new york horror crew.com to check out our nerd thrift shop. And did you want to do any more shout outs?
No, I did it at the beginning. I got out of the way early, but yeah, definitely come and check out Raised by Rentals. I'm not sure exactly when this episode will come out, but we have some really cool episodes that are going to be coming out later this year. And our spooky season will be starting up in September. Every year on Raised by Rentals, we do a multi-episode series of horror-themed episodes. So if you are into improv storytelling and horror, definitely tune in over the next couple of months.
Yes. Yes, and I've been loving season 3 with you guys doing more of like, your original ideals. Like, I'm definitely digging that.
Awesome. Yeah, glad to hear it. Thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me on the show. This has been a lot of fun. I hope I, didn't dominate the conversation just going on and on and on about Image Comics. I've really been trying to rein it in because I could go on for hours.
Yeah, no. This is like the whole thing is about me interviewing, you guys, my friends that I admire that do interesting things and have interesting hobbies that I enjoy. So I do want to listen to you ramble. So that's perfect.
Well, that's good. I've listened to you and all of your interviews so far. I've listened to every episode and I've caught up
Oh,
on the
wow.
few recent ones that I was behind on because I wanted to, I didn't want to get on here and have you mention some episode from last time, like, oh crap, I missed that one. But no, I did. It's a great show, and I like listening to, just conversational, conversations. Yeah, it's an interesting format for the show, so definitely keep it up.
Yeah, I really enjoy it. And I have a ton more episodes coming and a ton more ideals and lots of interesting people. Like Buffalo's great for that, like there's so many great people. And, we reach out to be on Buffalo with the Red Pantheons.
Hmm. That's right. Yeah, I'm down here in Texas. We got a couple of us down here in Texas, but yeah, we're kind of all over the place. And yeah, and that's one thing too. Like you guys are always talking about like events and conventions and shows and stuff that are going on that you're taking like the Western New York Horror Crew to, or that Mike Alvarez, my partner on Raised by Rentals and Boogeyman's Closet, that he's taking or that he's going to, for conventions with his artwork. And I'm always like, man, I'm like all the way down here in Texas. We got cool stuff down here, but there aren't as many of us. It's just mostly just me and Josh Hibbard of Pickman's Vinyls, another plug from the Red Pantheon.
Yes. Yep. And Count Creepyheads.
That's right.
So,
Count Creepyhead's Saturday Morning Monster Mash. Yeah, definitely. That's yeah, a show that I say it all the time. It's a show that I love because not only are Mike and Josh, it's really funny and just really good at podcasting. But I've said it before on multiple podcast episodes that I'm not a toy collector, and so I don't have a lot of the same interests that show is geared toward covering. But I can't wait to listen to every single episode because it's just so fun to like hang out with your friends, whether we're
yeah.
recording or listening. It's like I listen to your show and I listen to, So It's Come to This, a Simpsons Family podcast, and all the podcasts in the network. And it's like I get to just hang out with my friends this way, especially since I'm all the way down here in Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been like my biggest thing too, is it's just awesome to hear everybody hanging out and just it reminds me of the Alvarez parties, rare occasions that we have those. So it's nice to have these podcasts and kind of hear everybody in between.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad I got a chance to be here. Yeah.
And then thanks for coming. And then next upcoming event will be August 24th. It's Carnival. It's a circus theme type event at the Statler. And there'll be vendors, and there's going to be Bewitched Buffalo, which is a bunch of local witches that do this awesome dancing and like just this whole like I'm falling for the word here. Performance art.
There
So
you go.
an amazing performance art piece. There we go. So
Nice.
it's going to be a cool time. So check that out. And then to quote Robert Kirkman, the pessimist looks down and hits his head. The optimist looks up and loses his footing. The realist looks forward and adjusts his path accordingly. Everybody enjoy your night and try to make someone smile. Bye.
Bye. Keep reading comics. Nice.
How can I